Hey YouTube, it's your boy, Tristan, and it's time for another D&D video. So it's been delayed for a little bit. I did say I'm not keeping to any sort of schedule, but I went on a little trip to California for VidCon, so things got tied up. Either way, let's talk about Tieflings. So I'm sure that you know a little bit about Tieflings from the D&D. They're sort of these human demonic hybrids that carry a dark legacy. We're going to talk a little bit about some of the real-world origins of them, although it's a little thin, but we'll get into it. In the Middle Ages, throughout Christian history, there have been the stories of monstrous or demonic births. Horrible creatures, usually made by some sort of dark union with the devil. You often heard about this in witchcraft trials and all sorts of fun stuff. And some of the tropes of these stories actually do surface in modern-day fiction. You do see a lot with the claims of alien-human hybrids, a sort of dark, monstrous birth story. And the story of monstrous births actually goes back quite far. There are stories from Euripides about women giving birth to and nursing animals as kind of part of Greek mythology. However, fear of demons is key in Christian mythology, especially in the Middle Ages. One of the apocalyptic texts of the Apocrypha, called Second Esdras, talks about one of the signs of the end of the world will be women giving birth to monstrous creatures. And as I said, often women having some sort of union with the devil have the curse of being given demon babies. We could talk a little bit with the case of Anne Hutchinson. So this is actually in the United States, or at least the British colonies in the United States in the 1600s. Anne Hutchinson was a inflammatory figure. She had strong doctrinal disagreements with the Puritans in early Massachusetts Bay Colony. And there's descriptions and writings about her that she had at least 30 quote-unquote monstrous births, which in retrospect, I think a lot of historians are assuming are miscarriages. In 1638, Hutchinson was brought up on trials because she was hosting these weekly Bible reading meetings and was being challenged to the authority of the Puritan Church. And in her trial, they assumed that these miscarriages were a sign of judgment from God. John Winthrop, the person who quoted the term city on a hill, made references that it probably had something to do with either her or her midwife having some sort of union or relationship with the devil, as all people who oppose the Puritans do. It meant to imply that she might have been practicing witchcraft. And the story of human demonic hybrids comes up a lot. You actually see this in the origin story of the Jersey Devil. The Jersey Devil was supposed to be a child that was brought about by a union between a woman and a demon. And you also have famous stories like Rosemary's Baby. There's actually a really great video about demon babies that was done by Ask a Mortician. So if you look in the comments or go to a card or something, you'll be able to get a little bit more of a description about the concept of demon babies and the hysteria around witchcraft in the Middle Ages. There's also two subjects that are similar to this that I think are going to be held for future videos. There is a creature called a cambion, which is a human incubus or succubus hybrid that is made by the union between a incubus and a succubus, but they're in the monster manual, so once I do a video about them in their own video, then we'll talk about that a bit more. And of course, there's the topic of demons and devils themselves, which I imagine will be its own video, and it will be a whole thing, because devils and demons in Dungeons & Dragons is huge and crazy. So now let's go into the official 5e stuff and talk about what it is that a Tiefling is. They are the spawn of an ancient demonic pact made by their ancestors ages and ages ago. And it's always pointed out in several different campaign settings that the curse, the demonic curse, the fiendish origin in their blood is a curse brought upon them by generations long past. Not even by parents. They point out over and over again that the direct pairing of a demon and a human results in something called a half-fiend and not a tiefling. So tieflings, it has to be something that is very, very deep in your ancestry, which leads to some interesting questions about original sin. It's very much a play on the idea in Christianity that all of humanity carries the sins of Adam and Eve with them, and we are living out the collective punishment brought down upon these two people at the dawn of humanity. And that in Christian mythology, humans are always trying to and failing to repay that debt. Now, tieflings have several noticeable features. They usually feature large horns, and from what I checked on the internet, they can be of any single type, so be creative. They also can have either normal human skin, or they can have different shades of red skin, so you get to play around with that a little bit too. Other very recognizably demonic features include prehensile tail, pointy teeth, all sorts of stuff like that. And the visible curse upon them also comes into discussions about discrimination. And discrimination is a theme that comes up a lot when talking about tieflings. Even in the player's handbook, they said that tieflings are often mistrusted and that they're often segregated into minority communities, or they live amongst other sort of ostracized races in order to be welcome. And because they are so discriminated against and downtrodden, there's a strong cultural backbone of self-reliance and also falling on the other side of the law. Tieflings are often warlocks and rogues because they've spent so much time unable to rise through the legitimate ranks. On top of that, their culture is very slow to trust, but once they do trust something, the loyalty goes deep. And originally there was one type of tiefling that gives you some features, but now there are Tiefling Sub-Races available for all of the 9 lords of the hells. There's a bunch of different Tiefling Sub-Races to sort of give yourself a different flavor bit depending upon what different type of demonic creature you are related to. And now the default tiefling is a tiefling related to Asmodeus, who is the chief lord of hell, which I'm sure we'll get into in its own video. So in the Forgotten Realms, I found that tieflings can be descendants from all sorts of fiendish creatures and not just devils. They can be from demons, they can be from Yugoloths, which I'm sure we'll talk about eventually, and evil deities. And tieflings also have high charisma, so there's a description that they have sort of a very persuasive way of learning, and they have a very mystical allure to them. But one thing that is pointed out in the Forgotten Realms as well as the Player's Handbook is that tieflings are not necessarily predisposed to any sort of alignment. They don't necessarily lean towards being evil. They can be all sorts of things. They can be all sorts of types of people in their lives. And so often the injustice of carrying the weight of this curse is reinforced over and over again. There's also a counterpart to the tiefling that shows up in a lot of things called an Aasimar, which is a union of a human with angelic powers, but I think that the Aasimars will have to be their own video at some point. The Forgotten Realms also has a series of tieflings that are hybrids with different races. They have the Feyri, which were tieflings that are made through the unions of demons and elves. You have the Wisplings, who are mixed with halflings, the Tanaruks, which are an orc demonic hybrid, and the Maluth, which is like a demonic mix between a dwarf and a demon. In Dark Sun, the harsh post-apocalyptic landscape means that tieflings are the result of people who made a very dark pact in order to survive and thrive in this harsh condition. They're known as raiders, they're remorseless, they're vile and evil creatures, hanging around nomadic bands, so think of them as like raiders, Mongols, motorcycle gangs, things like that. Although for that pact they made, tieflings in Dark Sun feel that they owe some sort of blood debt, either killing in the name of the demon that they serve, or trying to make amends or try to make things even for the sins of their fathers. And some just give up and live lives of debauchery. So that whole idea that there's some sort of debt or some sort of curse can play a heavy element in either your tiefling character or tieflings in your setting. In Eberron, tieflings were made as a sort of dark pact that was made in order to increase the arcane power of a group of humans. These humans were trying to become more and more powerful spellcasters, and this curse is sort of a mark of them delving too far. And of course you have to talk about Planescape, which is actually where tieflings first showed up, Planescape in 2nd edition. Tieflings are commonly in the planes, and they often are intermediaries between the hells and the other races. And other planes, for that matter. You find a lot of tieflings in places like the City of Brass in the Plane of Fire, or in the City of Dis, which is in the Nine Hells. In Ravenloft, they're the descendants of an ancient empire that made a demonic pact for military power. And now that kingdom has been put into ruin, and tieflings carry the burden of that dark legacy for all time. You're starting to see a pattern here. Pathfinder in Golarion, it's a lot of the same stories, except that in Golarion they seem to like to up the racism angle a little bit. And there's also a demonic empire called Cheliax that has a lot of tieflings in it, but they are definitely second-class citizens, even though they serve the purpose of being an intermediary between their fiendish overlords and the rulers of that society. And also in Pathfinder, the idea of a tiefling being more of a curse than a straight-up race is kind of interesting. So you can actually, if you have a half-fiend in your bloodline, you will always have a chance of giving birth to a tiefling, even if you're a normal human and your mate is a normal human. And so it's like this curse that could just show up in family bloodlines every few generations or so. And I have never been able to play him in a serious way, but I have a tiefling character that I've been sitting on and wanting to play that is basically this idea. Fancy Family has made a deal with the devil in order to get themselves into a place of nobility and privilege, except that it means that every 7th generation, their child ends up being... The child that is set up to be the legal heir will be a tiefling. And usually that tiefling is predisposed to corruption and will skew towards darker influences. And it's a sort of attempt for more demonic influence and chaos upon the world. But hopefully that tiefling character will, whenever I get to play him, choose the right thing. And we also have to talk about Exandria and the Critical Role setting. One thing that sticks out as different in Exandria compared to other campaign settings is that tieflings come in a variety of colors. In the current season of Critical Role, there are 2 tieflings in the party. There's Jester, the cleric, and there's Mullymok, the blood hunter. And both of them are not red. One is lavender and one is blue. So there is already a bit more variety in tiefling skin colors that comes up as interesting, and I think is a great thing to transport to the campaign, because only red tieflings can get a bit boring. Tieflings also are typically the progenitors of fire genasi, and they have a sort of relationship with the plane of fire that hasn't been fully fleshed out in any of Matt Mercer's writings, but could be a thing. There's also no definitive origin for tieflings, but the best guess is that in this far-off era where things were way more magical, called the Age of Arcanum, that tieflings were the result of some sort of pact made with some warlocks. And the racism is pretty strong in Exandria, and so tieflings tend to keep to urban areas and more cosmopolitan settings. And I think Warcraft has done some amazing stuff to make their tieflings just a little bit more interesting. So tieflings in Warcraft are called the Draenei. And they actually started off as this neutral race that got a lot of holy powers by worshipping these alien races called the Naaru. And in the Warcraft setting, the Naaru are these semi-divine creatures that are the source of all of the holy powers. But there's a story behind that. The Naaru found them as refugees. So the Draenei lived for quite a while, and then they came under the view of the Dark Titan Sargeras and were corrupted by that Titan to become a leader in the demonic burning legions called the Eridar. And I should say that it's important that this has been retconned, because if you read the Warcraft 2 manual, it was actually the evil Eridar that convinced Sargeras to become evil, but they decided to switch that up so that they could make the Draenei playable in Burning Crusade. So the Draenei who did not take the demonic corruption and become the Eridar became refugees from their home planet of Argus, and that is where they found the Naaru and became very dedicated paladins and priests and things like that. And those that did not go ended up on Draenor, which is where the Burning Crusade takes place. And on that planet, they found themselves again under the threat of demonic forces. This time it was their corruption of the orcs. They were basically brought to the brink of genocide, and in the years since the beginning of the Warcraft universe, the Draenei have become twisted and corrupted by dark magics, eventually making an alliance of convenience with Illidan, Stormrage, for the Burning Crusade storyline. Although there are Draenei that escaped from Draenor on a ship called the Exodar, and the Exodar is the crash-landed ship in which a playable Draenei starts his or her story. And I was also thinking about where tieflings fit in Warhammer. They kind of fit, but the story's a little bit different. In both Warhammer Fantasy and 40k, there is the gods of chaos and the warp and demons, but demon-human hybrids really are not so much the idea of original sin and all those kinds of things, because redemption really isn't a thing in the Warhammer storylines. It has a lot of fascist undertones in it, but chaos in general, the chaos gods do mutate and warp humans into things like chaos humans and chaos marines and things like that. But I think that's like a little bit different from what they're thinking of. In my setting, tieflings are the result of some pretty interesting aspects. Humans have a unique feature about them. And this is a thing that I think is only in my setting, but makes a lot of sense if you read a lot of the material, and that is humans are the only race in my setting that can successfully breed with other races. And so often tieflings are the result of some sort of demonic union, often very far in the past. So all the prejudice and stuff still plays true. Although I do say that the generations of stigma and the being wanderers in their own societies have led tieflings to congregate in a lot of ways, and in the generations it's been since there have been tieflings, they have established their own culture, one that does feel very much that loyalty to family is number one, and that doing things that are outside of the law is not necessarily wrong. They're kind of like the mafia in that sense. And sometimes tieflings can be hidden for multiple generations. So there are tieflings they've bred with other tieflings, all of their friends and family are tieflings, but the tiefling and a human pairing could result in a regular human, but that human could give birth to a tiefling 2 or 3 generations later. So once the demon is in your blood, there is always a chance that you'll have children that are tieflings, but a tiefling and a tiefling will probably always have a tiefling child. So there are a lot of cases where there are tieflings who are fully tiefling culture, everything like that, but also the occasional family might have infernal bloodline that might occasionally result in the occasional tiefling child, and that tiefling will feel very alienated in the main tiefling society. So it's a very interesting dynamic, and I hope that someday I run into a player who wants to play a tiefling in my campaign setting so I can see how that goes. And of course, I've talked about gods in my previous thing, and evil gods that have demons as their minions would use tieflings as a way to be a branding opportunity to increase belief in their existence in order to give them power. So tieflings, just by existing, are a sort of branding opportunity for the more evil gods in the universe. And so we come to, how do you play a tiefling? How do you run a tiefling in your adventures? And I would always say you should play with stereotypes. The entire idea behind tieflings is that it's unfair what's happening to them, and that all of the things that they're driven to do is usually due to their social context and not by their essential nature, which is very important. And so things about negative stereotypes, assumptions about criminality, things like that could lead to tieflings being a way to play out prejudice in a way that is a little bit less overt, because in our world we do have racism, but not against demon people. As a DM who's running with a tiefling or wants to do a tiefling-centered story, discussions about original sin and collective guilt. Talk about ideas that happen in the Middle Ages where things that could run in your family could be blamed upon you even though you had nothing to do with it. And the whole troubling nature that brings up, especially when it comes to Christian mythology and Christian stories. And of course, in a society that has prejudice and discrimination, you can tell the story of tieflings trying to survive and thrive in an unjust world. As for straight up game things, they have different attribute stats and different infernal legacy traits based on what kind of tiefling you have. But one thing that does seem to be always the case is that when it comes to your attributes, charisma, you're going to get a bit of charisma, which means tieflings tend to be pretty and they tend to be very convincing. And it also means that they make good warlocks, not surprisingly, and they also make good bards. And tiefling bards, I don't see enough of them. As far as their culture and playing them, think about the context they grew up in. Think about where tieflings sit in your setting, but for the most part, tieflings are living amongst humans, and they probably have absorbed whatever culture it is they grew up amongst. And of course, you got your dark vision, you got your fire resistance, you got your infernal language. So There's all sorts of fun you can do with being able to play with demonic storylines in your Tiefling story or in your character's overall background. And in Infernal Legacy, every Tiefling gets a different spell, a couple spells that they can cast depending upon what kind of demonic patron that they came from. Either way, that's Tieflings. They're a cool story, one that we can use to bring in stories about demons and good and evil, and also where good and evil is not so straightforward. There's stories about prejudice, discrimination, stereotypes, and injustice, and Tieflings can play at the center of all of those things. So please, if you want to have a Tiefling, you can definitely play up a lot of really interesting conflicts that we don't have a solution to as a society, which makes for interesting narrative. Anyways, if you haven't yet, you should subscribe to this channel. You should share it on your favorite subreddits. Do whatever you can. This channel's small, but people seem to really like it, so I'd really love to see more people seeing this content and making their D&D campaigns just a little bit more rich. And we'll see you guys next time.